Welcome to the debate where we examine substantive issues arising from the material we've collected.
And today, the focus is on obsessive-compulsive disorder, specifically a really painful manifestation known as scrupulosity. This is where the obsessions intensely involve religious, spiritual, or moral doctrines, and they create just immense guilt, doubt, and really debilitating anxiety.
Yeah, and the question that absolutely paralyzes individuals who are trapped in this cycle is, it's profound, isn't it? How do I definitively distinguish my condition, this OCD, from just, rigorous, healthy devotion? And maybe even more critically, what's the key leverage point? What do I need to do to stop fueling this OCD engine and actually achieve some lasting recovery?
That's such a critical framing because this condition is uniquely painful. These unwanted intrusive thoughts, they might be about blasphemy or accidentally sinning or moral impurity. The sufferer interprets them not just as random mental noise or symptoms, but as actual evidence of their own moral failure or even spiritual damnation. And that, understandably, leads to overwhelming distress.
Indeed. So we're going to debate whether the most direct and effective path to healing is primarily through the systematic behavioral elimination of compulsions. That's the gold standard, exposure and response prevention, or ERP, or
whether a foundational cognitive shift, specifically learning to embrace the intrinsic uncertainty involved, often using principles from acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, whether that must necessarily come first or at least really closely accompany the behavioral work to make it stick.
Okay, so I'll be arguing that the core issue is the compulsive behavior. Whether it's mental, like ruminating or checking yourself, or physical, like excessive praying or confessing. This behavior is what prevents the necessary habituation and learning, and therefore strict response prevention has to be the central therapeutic action.
And I'll argue that, while behavior change is obviously essential, the primary driver of the whole problem is actually a core cognitive deficit, this fundamental inability to tolerate spiritual or moral uncertainty. And so, building psychological flexibility is required to truly disarm those thoughts and establish, lasting recovery.
All right, let's lay out the positions more fully. My position is really grounded in the functional mechanism of the disorder itself. Scrupulosity, like all OCD, it isn't maintained by the initial thought popping into your head. It's maintained by the compulsive act you perform in response to that thought. These compulsions, they can range from obvious physical things like excessive checking, repeating confessions over and over, demanding reassurance from clergy, or they can be purely internal, mental acts. Things like endless ruminations, mentally reviewing past actions, trying to neutralize a bad thought with a good one, or constant self-reassurance. The key is they are performed solely to neutralize fear or guilt.
Right, for that short-term fix.
Exactly. The mechanism is pretty straightforward, actually. The compulsion provides that temporary, short-term anxiety relief, which then negatively reinforces the entire cycle. The brain learns, essentially, okay, anxiety feels terrible, doing this ritual makes it go away for a bit. Therefore, the ritual must be absolutely essential. So the core therapeutic tool we have to leverage is habituation. You systematically confront the feared thoughts or situations. That's the exposure part, while making a very deliberate choice not to engage in the compulsive behavior. That's the response prevention. And this really needs to be rigid. We aim to eliminate, ideally, 100% of the ritual so that the anxiety is forced to decrease naturally over time. This teaches the nervous system two things. One, the feared outcome doesn't actually happen, and two, maybe more importantly, the anxiety itself is survivable and temporary. The response, the ritual, that's the fuel. Stop the fuel, the engine sputters out.
Okay, I see why you foreground the behavioral lever. I really do. And nobody disputes the power of response prevention when it works. But I would frame the core problem somewhat differently. Maybe looking at the initial vulnerability that makes someone susceptible in the first place. I think the disorder is fundamentally rooted in this cognitive error that researchers call intolerance of uncertainty, or IU. It's this IU that drives the desperate, frankly endless quest for absolute certainty in matters that are inherently unknowable, like, am I really pure enough, or is my faith genuine? You just can't know those things with 100% certainty.
And furthermore, scrupulous individuals show an exceptionally high degree of something called moral thought-action fusion, TAF. Now, let's just make that technical term accessible. Thought-action fusion is basically where your brain treats a thought as if it were an action. It gives the mere thought a moral weight it doesn't actually deserve. So when someone believes that just thinking something blasphemous or immoral is morally equivalent to committing that act, well, then that intrusive thought isn't just an unpleasant mental event, it's perceived as an existential threat.
Right. The stakes feel incredibly high.
Incredibly high. Therefore, for deep, long-term change, I argue we must first work on establishing psychological flexibility. This means teaching concrete skills like cognitive diffusion, learning to step back and view obsessions as merely thoughts or, mental noise, not as literal facts or commands from God or the devil. And we need acceptance, which isn't liking the feeling, but adopting a willingness to feel the anxiety, to hold the doubt without automatically reacting. Because without this foundational internal shift, this willingness and the ability to see thoughts just as thoughts, many clients view your necessary ERP exposures as just too morally risky or even downright sinful. And that resistance, that leads to non-adherence, dropout. So for me, acceptance of the uncertainty has to precede or at least heavily inform the exposure work if you want meaningful, lasting change.
That's an interesting point about the moral vulnerability from thought-action fusion. But let's get back to the engine itself. We can probably agree that intolerance of uncertainty and thought-action fusion are, let's say, the preconditions, maybe the vulnerability. But they are only sustained. The cycle only keeps going because the compulsion offers that brief relief. The ritual itself, whether it's that mental review, the repeated confession, praying until it feels just right, that is what prevents the patient from ever learning that the feared outcome doesn't happen and that their cognitive error, the TAF or the IU, is actually baseless in reality.
So you're saying the behavior is the key regardless.
I'm saying if we demand 100% ritual prevention, we directly undercut the very mechanism that keeps the IU-TEF error alive. Yes, the anxiety spikes initially, that's expected. The patient has to resist the urge to ritualize. And then, the anxiety eventually fades on its own. ERP teaches, functionally, through experience, that the thought is meaningless precisely because the response has been broken and the world didn't end, their soul wasn't lost. We leverage the behavior change to correct the cognition, not necessarily the other way around first.
I'm sorry, but I just don't fully buy that the behavioral lever is always sufficient on its own, especially, for the purely obsessive, purely ruminative forms of scrupulosity where the compulsions are all internal. Focusing only on stopping the ritual, even a mental one, can absolutely fail if the individual is highly, highly fused with their thoughts. If I am genuinely convinced, deep down, that writing down a blasphemous phrase, even for an exposure exercise, is truly equivalent to committing that sin, well, simply telling me don't mentally erase the phrase isn't likely to work. The moral terror will just be too overwhelming.
But isn't that where the exposure hierarchy comes in? You start small.
Of course. But even small exposures can feel impossible if the fusion is strong enough. We must first address the misinterpretation of these normal, albeit disturbing, intrusive thoughts. If the client truly views that blasphemous thought not as brain static, but as, say, a command from a demon, they need the skills of diffusion first. They need to learn to recognize it as just mental static or my OCD talking before they can realistically tolerate not responding to it, like the acceptance and commitment therapy model suggests, right? We teach the individual that the goal isn't to fight or control the obsession, but to hold it more lightly. Like seeing thoughts as annoying passengers on a bus. The driver of the bus, the self, the person's core values, chooses to ignore those noisy passengers and just keep driving toward their valued destination,
like being a loving parent or a devout community member. If we don't first help them diffuse from the thought, the urge to ritualize even just mentally arguing back will likely be overwhelming and just lead straight back to relapse.
Okay, let's maybe shift to metrics then, because how we measure success often dictates where we put our therapeutic focus, doesn't it? The success of traditional behavioral ERP is, well, it's typically measured by habituation. Specifically, you stay in the feared situation, you do the exposure, until the anxiety decreases significantly. We often track this using the SUD scale, the subjective units of distress, that simple 0 to 10 scale, 10 being panic. And we're looking for, say, a 50% drop in that score, or at least until there's a clear violation of the expectancy, the belief that the terrible outcome will happen. This metric, the argument goes, ensures they learn they can tolerate the discomfort until it subsides naturally, and that increases their sense of mastery over the anxiety.
That's a compelling argument for maybe short-term mastery, and I see the logic. But have you considered the potential unintended consequence of focusing so heavily on that SUD score? Focusing primarily on short-term anxiety reduction can paradoxically interfere with long-term learning. It can even inadvertently create a new kind of compulsion. If the patient's underlying goal, even during ERP, remains merely, I need to get my anxiety down, they are subtly, maybe unconsciously, still seeking certainty that the discomfort will end quickly. They might start using the ERP ritual itself, the exposure task, as a way to control their internal state, which is still fundamentally a form of control-safe-control, dressed up differently.
I see the potential pitfall there.
Yeah, so ACT-based approaches, or ACT-informed ERP, deliberately shift the focus away from the anxiety scores. We measure success differently. We measure it by values-based behavioral commitment. The aim becomes, can the person commit to the exposure for a predetermined set time, let's say 20 minutes, specifically to practice being the kind of person I want to be, like a faithful person who attends services despite intrusive thoughts, or a present parent who can bathe their child despite harm obsessions. They do this while making space for whatever uncomfortable internal experience shows up, anxiety, doubt, guilt. The goal becomes tolerance of uncertainty and moving forward in valued action, regardless of the SUD score. We actually view the SUD score as just another internal experience the client needs to practice accepting, not eliminating. Your faith presumably is about commitment and value, not about a guarantee of emotional calm, right? So our treatment needs to reflect that commitment, not just chase the fleeting feeling of anxiety relief.
That reframing towards values certainly resonates with the scrupulosity theme, which brings us perhaps to the most difficult practical question for someone suffering. Is this really OCD, or am I just being deeply faithful? How do I tell? How do we help the individual know if their excessive spiritual actions are pathological or genuine devotion? My contention is that it comes down almost entirely to the function of the act, regardless of its specific spiritual content.
The why behind it?
Exactly. The why. A religious practice becomes compulsive if, and really only if, it is performed in response to an obsessional fear or doubt with the immediate intent to neutralize anxiety or guilt. For example, the material we looked at suggests praying for the courage to engage in ERP is perfectly appropriate. That's values aligned, moving towards recovery. But repeatedly praying for forgiveness specifically regarding an intrusive, obsessional fear, even if the prayer itself sounds religiously sound, that's a clear violation of response prevention because its function is fear-based. It's about getting certainty, not faith-based acceptance. The key difference, I think, is that fear demands certainty, while genuine faith accepts mystery.
I absolutely agree on the functional definition being primary. The why is definitely more important than the what. That said, I often come at it from a slightly different angle when trying to educate clients, mainly because that functional definition can feel a bit too abstract or slippery when they're just drowning in doubt and guilt. Comparing their specific actions to the norm within their own faith community can be an incredibly valuable sort of externalized tool.
Okay, like a reality check?
Exactly.
Scrupulosity is typically, almost by definition, inconsistent with the practices of the rest of the faith community. The person's behavior often wildly exceeds or even disregards major central tenets of their religion to focus excessively on some trivial or peripheral detail. This is that phenomenon people talk about, like acting more Catholic than the Pope, or, endlessly repeating confessions for things a priest has already definitively forgiven and told them not to confess again. So we can sometimes use what some clinicians call the 85% rule as a rough guidepost. If fewer than, say, 85% of their peers in that specific faith community engage in that particular behavior, like repeating specific prayers hundreds of times or demanding absolute ritualistic purity in minor practices way beyond scriptural or communal requirements, then it is highly likely driven by the disorder, not by healthy devotion.
It just provides a more tangible external metric that can sometimes help the sufferer start to recognize that their internal rules are maybe idiosyncratic and pathological, not actually divine requirements.
That's a practical yardstick. And thinking about fueling the engine, regardless of whether you prioritize the behavioral or the cognitive route first, the quintessential act that feeds OCD, particularly scrupulosity, has got to be reassurance-seeking, right?
Oh, absolutely. Constant reassurance seeking.
Whether it's running to clergy constantly, badgering family members, or just endless Google searches about types of sin or signs of damnation, that behavior is designed solely to reduce the immediate anxiety and gain some temporary feeling of certainty. And why is it so uniquely powerful and damaging in scrupulosity? I think it's because the perceived stakes feel infinite, literally the fate of their eternal soul. So that desperate quest for a definitive answer becomes almost irresistible. But it's universally counterproductive to recovery because every time they seek reassurance, it just tells the brain, see, this doubt is valid, it is dangerous, and it must be solved, rather than learning that the doubt itself can just be tolerated.
Yeah, it reinforces the idea that uncertainty is intolerable.
Precisely. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We've explored two, I think, quite sophisticated viewpoints on tackling the core challenge of scrupulosity. Do we need to prioritize breaking that behavioral cycle of rituals using strict response prevention first and foremost?
Or must we first help the person gain the psychological flexibility and acceptance needed to willingly, even if uncomfortably, embrace the intrinsic uncertainty that comes with faith and morality?
And the material seems clear that successful recovery really requires highly specialized treatment. It's treatment that can navigate this very delicate relationship between clinical intervention and the person's deeply held faith practices. Ultimately, though, it feels like both methodologies, ERP and ACT-informed approaches, they kind of converge on the absolute necessity of learning to tolerate doubt and fear. Learning to move forward in faith, or just commitment to one's values, despite that nagging, unanswered question in the back of your mind, I just don't know for sure.
Right. And understanding that these intrusive, often horrific thoughts are what we call ego-dystonic, meaning they are fundamentally unwanted, they're inconsistent with the sufferer's true moral character and values. That understanding can be the start of allowing some self-compassion and beginning the process of disengaging from the struggle with the thoughts.
Yeah, that's key. And understanding those underlying mechanisms we've discussed, that intolerance of uncertainty driving the bus and the reinforcing power of the compulsive ritual keeping the engine running, that understanding seems to be the key to helping someone free themselves from the disorder's control. And finally, stopping that relentless, exhausting, and ultimately futile search for absolute certainty in a realm that, by its nature, perhaps only offers faith.